Welcome, Color Quest friends. So happy to have you here. I have been traveling a good part of this year, but for the next month I'm going to be home in my studio in the Pacific Northwest, and it's summertime. So I am actually going to be working with dye flowers that I have been growing myself. It's true. I had a video last year in the springtime where I grew different types of dye plants from seed. Started in my kitchen, never done that before, and it was a lot of fun. I was really successful until I transplanted them. But you know, that's how it goes. I learned a lot, and I did have a few plants that stuck around. So let's take a look at what I'm growing in my dye garden this summer, and over the next few weeks, let's play around with some of those flowers. So as you may recall, last year I moved into a space that had no garden area or yard, but it did have these wonderfully huge pots, which I was able to plant my dye plants in. And last year I did have some plants that I was able to use in a few videos. Now something has happened since last year, and I have to say it's made me quite sad. I want to share it with you before we go look at this year's dye plants, because if you remember the space that I moved into and how happy I was, it had a lot to do with a forested area that was right behind my house. Things have changed. Check this out. This is the change. Yes, indeed. This was in fact 5 acres of forest behind me. And as you can see now, no longer forest. So I will not be filming out here any longer. Here's another view. You can see the pots down there, which we will wander down to. But this now is what I look at from the main part of my house. It's really distressing. They're going to be building 64 units here. And it's been so far 4 months of just non-stop heavy equipment, land prepping. The deforestation side was just horrific to watch. And now it's just no longer a space I'm that interested in being in. But I suppose that's how life goes. Things change. Luckily, I won't be staying here forever, maybe another year. And then I'm going to be heading south to my house that I have down in the central coast of California. So we'll work with what we got. I am pretty happy with the pots that I have downstairs. So let's go check it out. Here we are. Beautiful day. A lot more sun coming in. If you recall from last year's video, that was one thing that I was maybe concerned about, is the lack of sunlight. They still only get direct sunlight part of the day, and not a very big part of the day, but there's just a heck of a lot more light up here now than there was, thanks to that. I want to talk about 3 different sets in terms of plants. The first one is the plants that survived from last year. Now I grew like, I don't know, 10 different dye plants last year, and they did great in their nice warm indoor environment. But then when I transplanted them, they weren't as happy. But some made it. I had some Coreopsis, some Indigo, some Marigold. Not a lot, but enough that I was able to do some things. And I actually did pretty well with the fresh leaf Indigo. Sadly, I didn't use as much as I wanted to because I was gone for 2 months in the middle of it. And by the time I got back from my residency, the frost had set in and I lost a lot of last year's fresh leaf Indigo. But a few things did survive. I want to show you that first, one of which is madder. So this is the madder plant from seed that I did last year. It sat in that corner over there all winter long, and it didn't die. As a matter of fact, it's doing okay. Now, madder brings about orange and red in the dye pot, but as you probably know, it's the madder root that brings color. So, and it takes a couple of years for that to happen. So having it in a pot is probably not the best way to go about growing madder. But maybe when I move to California, I can transplant what's here into the ground. And maybe in a couple years, I will get madder root. So the second plant that made it was hollyhock. So I had, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 hollyhock from seed. I had 2 that made it after the transplant, and then this one survived. It survived the winter. It was sitting in here. It was practically nothing. I planted it on a total whim, thinking, yeah, well, if it makes it, it makes it, knowing that in the Netherlands, they grow in between the cracks of the sidewalk and they continue to flourish. Now, I don't know, there's new growth there. Hollyhock produces flowers from certain stalks, I believe only every other year. So it's a biennial, I guess is what they call it. And I know this from the color farm where the first year I worked out there, they had the plant but no flowers, and then the second year it was just filled with hollyhock. So if this were the second year, maybe I'll get a flower stalk at some point. I don't know. This will also be one that I will probably try to transplant or maybe save the seeds because I love hollyhock. I used to grow them when I lived in Montana like decades ago, and they were so incredible. And after having spent the time in the Netherlands, I mean, they're just a spectacular dye flower to have. You can print with them, you can make dye with them. Like last week, look at that, we made some more dye after we used them for ice dyeing and for hammer printing. So hollyhock for the win. It is such a gorgeous flower for the garden, and it seeds back and it comes back year after year. So those are the 2 plants that made it. Now, let's look at the new plants. Several of these plants were plants that I actually bought at a nursery. And the reason I did that was because I had a Tataki Zome class that I was teaching in May, but I didn't think about the fact that there weren't going to be that many flowers, at least not in my own dye garden. So I went to a nursery and I chose flowers that I knew would be good for hammer printing, but also would be pretty in the garden. And I bought them on sale. They were sort of past their prime in terms of looking fresh and new for people to buy. Let me show you those. So violets are just so quintessential spring and beautiful. These are at their end of their season, but they really print nicely with hammer printing, and we did some pretty cool things by shifting them with iron. So I have a few of those left, and then they're just so pretty in the garden. So another flower I bought for printing was the African daisy. I have never tried to do anything with these, and they hammer printed really well. The color is so beautiful. I just have no idea if it translates into a dye color. I think we'll try it with maybe some steam dyeing and see what happens. It might not be light fast or wash fast, but it's a beautiful flower to have in the garden as well. Now, geranium, these were super on sale, but I mean, they're just so pretty and so vibrant, and they printed really well. I also really like geranium leaves because geranium leaves are great for botanical printing. So maybe later in the fall, I can use some of these and try them out in an eco print environment. You never know with plants this color. I mean, super vibrant reds and pinks, you know, they don't necessarily turn into a long-lasting dye, but they did print nicely with hammer, and I don't know, maybe we'll try them out in the steam for echo printing. And this is just kind of fun. I was back from Holland and I looked in here and there are all these mushrooms growing. So I have no idea what kind of mushrooms they are, but it certainly was a fun little surprise to see these growing in and around this. I don't know if it came from the soil that I have or from this plant itself, but it's kind of a cute little surprise. I also bought these yellow marigolds as well as these super double colorful ones, and I did that to see how they would print, which they did. We didn't get anything too spectacular with those, but marigolds are also great dye flowers. So I'll probably put them in my dye pot at some point later this year. The last plant that I bought at the nursery was Pincushion. Now, the Black Knight Scabiosa definitely is a dye flower. This was obviously a different color. We used it in Tataki-Zome. I haven't tried to make any kind of a dye pot with it, but I figured since I know that Black Knight Scabiosa prints, why not? It was super on sale, and it's just pretty. I also have seen like some dye flowers in just the grocery store, like Coreopsis, gorgeous, full, and you can buy them if you didn't get around to or weren't lucky enough to plant from seed or early on starters. I did then buy some starters back in May of 5 different dye plants that I know are stars. I bought these from a local farm that has both produced vegetables, herbs, and they also grow a handful of dye flowers and dye plants. They raise sheep and use the wool, so it kind of makes sense that they would have some dye plants on the farm as well. And they were selling starters in May, so I was lucky enough to snag a few of those. Sulfur Cosmos. These are such an incredible dye plant in terms of making beautiful prints. So I'm definitely going to be doing some botanical printing with those. And they also make a really vibrant yellow orange in the dye pot. I used these the first year with the Color Farm and did some prints as well as a dye pot or 2. And I'm happy to be growing them here. I even have some that are more yellow in color. So different shades. That one's a little bit more yellow and that sort of traditional orange color of the Tango Sulfur Cosmo. And of course, what would a dye garden be without Coreopsis? This is such an incredible dye flower. I have worked with it several times over the last year or 2, both with the Color Farm and on my own with some printing. And I will definitely be using these this summer, I think, to make prints, and then maybe later on or as they begin to fade, keeping these kinds of bits to save as dried petals to make dye pots. Always a great thing if you can use them as they fade. Keep these beautiful fresh ones for printing, and you can just play around. Coreopsis, amazing dye flower. Hello, sir. Thank you for the work that you do. Look at your little pollen pants. I just love you. And look what I found. Another mushroom family. Maybe you have some little kabouters in there too. Hee hee. I also bought Crackerjack Marigold starters, and that's what these are. They are not yet blooming, so I only have the marigolds that I bought this spring, and these will probably come up a little bit later, but I'm going to have a lot of marigold to play with. I also have to share my dye plants with slugs, so you can see this one has been completely munched, and it used to look like this. Oh, slugs. Okay, the other plant that I decided to buy from the farm was Black-Eyed Susan, or Rudbeckia. I did use these one time in a dye video to look at the centers, the petals, and the leaves to see what different colors you would get, because Rudbeckia is known for bringing about a green. Wasn't expecting it to be this red Rudbeckia though. I was thinking it would be the yellow one. I'm not sure. I have two here. Maybe this one will be yellow, maybe not. We'll have to try that out. There aren't that many that are going to come up, at least right now, so I'll have to be very selective in how I choose to use that. And this is Black Knight Scabiosa, or Pincushion. These hopefully will flower sometime in August. I have a few that are coming up. They make such a gorgeous sort of gray-green, bluish color. Really pretty. And I hope to get a few different plants. There's some really young ones there. Anyway, that'll be fun to be a later in the season dye flower to work with. So pretty. And last, but certainly not least, is my fresh leaf indigo. Look at that. So this came from the farm as well, and I bought 3 or 4 pots. I actually lost one, or one got hit pretty hard in some hot weather. I planted it anyway, and guess what? It survived. I think it's this little guy back here. Suffice to say, I'll have enough to do some printing, maybe to do a little bit of salt rub dyeing or blender method, and the blues that come from that are exquisite, and it's so easy to grow. Love you, fresh leaf indigo. I almost forgot one more pot. This is a very special pot. These are malabar spinach sprouts, and one of our lovely Color Quest family members sent me seeds from her garden. Thank you very much, Barbara. She has made some beautiful dye colors with these, so I'm hoping they're going to come up enough this year in this climate so that we might be able to try them out in the dye pot. So that is my garden tour for this year. Wherever you are, some of these dye plants can completely be grown simply in pots. So I hope that this video will inspire you to know that even if you don't have acreage to be able to grow your own dye flowers, you can in fact do so with so many different kinds in pots. So it can be for an urban garden or just a small porch garden. Definitely a great place to start if you want to start growing your own dye plants. All of these plants will produce color either in a print or in your dye pot, and it's so easy to have a few just hanging around to play with. So next week on Color Quest, let's start using some of these dye flowers. What do you think about that? I've got a few ideas of how we might play around with these for the next couple of weeks here on Color Quest. Have a great week, and I will see you next Friday. So the second, I live right by an airport, lots of airplane traffic.